Welcome back to Past and Presents. This is our season finale, our last episode. It's our road trip episode. We've only been doing the show for 2 years, but it's become an important tradition to end on the road. Specifically Highway 212, heading out west of Minneapolis towards the Minnesota River Valley, because that was the scene of a short but really interesting tragic conflict in August-September of 1862, the U.S. Dakota War. So we'll have more to say about that conflict and why we're visiting a battlefield site and some memorial sites related to it. But why do a road trip? Well, Past and Presents suggests the enduring importance of the past to the present. So we'll talk about the importance of memory today. But also a big theme of this series of webisodes has been the importance of place, of location, of getting out of the classroom, whether it's somewhere on Bethel's campus or its old campus or elsewhere in the Twin Cities, or even you've got glimpses of Europe, to get a sense of how history is shaped by the places, the look, the feel of the settings of the events we talk about. And at least at times in this webisode, we've talked about the idea of the past as a foreign country. And so visiting the past implies movement, implies travel, implies journey. And so we invite you this week to go on a journey with us back to the year 1862 in a conflict between European Americans and Native Americans here in Minnesota. Context for our story here today. We'll be soon coming to the site of a battlefield after our first faculty conversation, but we need to understand a little bit of what's causing this conflict in August-September of 1862. While the rest of the country is fighting a civil war, Minnesota becomes the battleground for a lot of pent-up frustration that had built up over the course of European settlement in this part of the United States. For generations going back, there had been fur trade in this part of Minnesota, in the Minnesota River Valley. You had intermarriage, commerce between Europeans and native populations like the Dakota. But in 1851, not far from St. Peter, Minnesota, Traverse des Sioux, several treaties are signed in which the Dakota restricted to a reservation. Land is then given to European settlers. Now, in exchange for that, the Dakota are supposed to be given annuities, something like $21 million, and then annuities are paid. However, partly because of the efforts of a fur trader, Indian agent named Joseph Brown, at least some of that money is actually used to settle the supposed debts of European traders, and so the annuities are reduced. As the years go on, and especially when Minnesota becomes a state in 1858, some of the reservation land is also taken away and given to settlers like the Germans who will be in New Ulm or will be along the tour at a certain point. And especially once the Civil War starts and the government's attention is diverted towards that conflict, it becomes very slow to pay the annuity payments. The Indians' normal trade and food supply patterns are disrupted, and so they have no money to buy food, and so Dakota are starving to death. And matters finally reach a head in August of 1862 when Dakota kill a family of 5, a little further north of here where we are. And then on August 19th, among other things, they burned down the house of Joseph Renshaw Brown, the fur trader I'd mentioned from 1851. That's not far from where we are now. We're close to Morton, Minnesota. And so a conflict erupts. Little Crow, the leader of the Dakota, kind of famously is ambivalent about this, not really sure this is the right thing to do. He decides that he needs to, and this is a chance to maybe reclaim some land from the United States government in the midst of the Civil War. And so battles rage for 5 to 6 weeks, especially here in the Minnesota River Valley, but other parts of the state, and even up into what then is still the Dakota Territory. So as our tour continues, we'll take you to the site of one relatively significant battle. We'll visit New Ulm, Minnesota, and then we'll find the end of the story in Mankato, Minnesota. Well, let's start our last faculty conversation of the season. So Amy and Anne-Marie, most of the students taking this class are probably in their first year, their second semester of college life. At this point, how much should they be thinking about things like career or vocation? What would be maybe some appropriate first steps as they look beyond even college life?
I will jump in on this one because I have very strong feelings about vocation and career. I think students should be thinking about their vocation, but I think vocation is different from career, and I know that's something we might talk about a little bit more later, but you know, we are at a Christian institution, and not everybody who comes here is Christian. But so in the sort of Christian setting, vocation is a calling, and for me, that's what God is calling you to do. And I think a liberal arts Christian education is the best place to explore what it is that God is calling you to do, because you actually have the opportunity to take a lot of different kinds of courses, including those in science. You came here thinking you were going to be a history major, and it turns out you love biology because you had to take this course. Is that God speaking to you? Is that God asking you to think about maybe your gift is here, maybe there's a calling there? So I think they should be thinking about their calling always, but I don't think they should be worried about what am I going to do to make a living after college, because I think that will come later.
And I think that is, I mean, I really like what you said, because I think that it's the idea of not answering the question of what am I supposed to do, but who am I supposed to be?
Yeah.
Which is something that we talk about a lot here at Bethel, I think. And so something that I feel like that we have worked on as a department in the last few years, and that I feel like we are getting better and better at it, is helping students be equipped to, again, not think specifically about what are you going to do, but rather who are you, what skills do you have, and how do we create sort of a seamlessness for you between hard skills and who you are, and that who you are contributes to those hard skills, and those hard skills help develop who you are as a person. So I think that that's something that's particularly important to think about, because I think that the more consciously you are thinking about that, then the better you're going to be at articulating that, whether it's to, you know, family and friends who say, what are you doing with a history major, or whether it is when you're looking at internships or future employers, that we're just as interested in who you are becoming, and that's directly tied. It's not independent from the actual skills that you're obtaining.
Well, let's talk about calling. We can come back to career maybe more specifically later on. I mean, I love what you're saying. I also know it's hard to hear the calling.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, one thing I talk with first year student, you're surrounded by voices, right?
Yes.
And not all of those are voices you ought to be listening to.
No.
And some that you shouldn't be listening to might be parents saying, here's what you ought to do with your life.
Yeah.
It might be pastors. It might be me, right? I might not actually know you. And you might not know you.
Right.
So, I mean, either maybe from your own personal experience, I don't know if you feel like you've got a kind of a call or moments of call, or like what advice do you have for students of how do you filter out the other voices and listen for the one that actually is doing that calling in their life?
I would say, you know, one thing that I've seen from students is they are reluctant to try lots of different kinds of things because they're concerned about failing. To me, failing gives you indications about what maybe you ought not to do, or how badly do you want it. Is that then an indication? Kevin Craig, a former history professor here, once told me that, you know, God sometimes calls you to what you love. And sometimes experiencing something and having great passion for it is an indication that you need to pursue that. And then maybe the door gets closed later on, but at least you have been faithful in pursuing it and responding to that. I think it also helps you be more creative about what you think about doing and applying for. And so as you're looking for classes and internships, okay, that doesn't seem to fit maybe with your history major, but, you know, is there a way in which working for the Twins organization, because you have such a love for this, does actually tie back into it in some way?
No, I agree with that 100%. I think that, one, on the first thing that you said, just about not having a fear of failure, and the idea that you have to try for things and trying for things and building, part of building virtue and building integrity is trying for things that you don't just know you're going to get.
Right.
It's shooting higher, and it's just going through that experience.
And it will hurt to fail.
It will hurt, and I think that that's something that our culture has lost a little bit of that value of the value of failure and of having to make new plans. And I think what that teaches you then is kind of goes to your other idea about the fact that, calling isn't one specific thing. And I think, again, we have to kind of take the time to do the hard work of saying, when you're called, we're not saying that you're called to one particular job.
Right.
Maybe you will be. I don't know. But calling is something that's about, if you were to look at the 7 different things you're interested in, can you find a common denominator between them?
Right.
You know, and so I think that that's one of the things, again, about our department that is great, is that, well, everyone feels compelled and is gifted in particular different areas related to the academic work they're doing. I think everyone actually feels very called to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And it may not be teaching specifically, like it has to be at this level, but it's that idea of what happens when we're teaching and working with others. And so to kind of help students think about, again, like what's the common denominator when you look at all of the different types of things that you enjoy, because we are very hyper focused on one career, one path, and that's not, I think we want you to confidently think differently than that.
I think of PreLaw as an advising program. There's no PreLaw major. So our PreLaw program consists of talking with students who are interested in going into law. One of the first things we want to do is assess whether or not law school is for them. It's not for everyone. It's really expensive. Law schools kind of tight these days in terms of the number of students they're admitting. So we want to assess that. I want to talk about the motivation that students have for going into law. There are lots of different types of careers in law, so we want to connect with students about that as well. So that's the first step in the advising process, but then there are other things as well, like what courses to take at Bethel. And then when it comes time, how to prepare for applying to law school. So we'll talk about the LSAT, the test that students have to take. We can also talk with students about interning with alums who are lawyers. It's a good way to get a sense of what a legal career is like. Sometimes a paralegal career is a better option for students as well, so we want to talk about that with them. Law schools are generally looking for a good liberal arts education, good background, and a history degree, a political science degree, an English degree. Those are fine degrees. But even beyond that, we would encourage students to take courses in the liberal arts. So if you major in history, take courses in economics, take courses in sociology, whatever interests you. That'll be attractive, I think, to a law school. So we try to help students in the advising process through that. But generally, a good liberal arts education, writing skills, good communication skills, those are the things that we're looking for.
So the U.S. Dakota conflict of 1862 did not feature many pitched battles, certainly nothing by comparison to the Civil War that was raging elsewhere in the United States. But we're at the site of one of the most important battles of the conflict. This is called Birch Cooley. It's in the Minnesota River Valley. This is now a state historic site, and really just fields, right? A prairie is being restored here. On September 2nd, 1862, a burial detail of Minnesota militia and volunteers and some civilians, maybe 150 or so, were recovering bodies and burying them in this area, and they were surprised and encircled by a group of 200 Dakota who besieged them for about 30 hours. In the end, about 20 were killed among European Americans, 90 horses, total of about maybe 50 or 60 casualties. Only 2 Dakota died. The commander, at least technically, was someone we've already met, Joseph Brown, the fur trader Indian agent, was given the rank of major. He was shot in the neck during this encounter. Eventually, a relief party was sent out from Fort Ridgely under the command of Henry Sibley, who was the first governor of Minnesota in 1858, and eventually served as a brigadier general in the Union Army during the Civil War. So this is an important site. There are multiple memorials around here, including one that was put up right at the turn of the 20th century to the loyal or the friendly Indians, whom European Americans regarded as having been heroic figures in the conflict. So another important site, but also a conflicted site in some ways. What is it exactly we're remembering here? Is this a proud moment, or is this just another piece of the larger tragedy? Okay, let's meet our another member of the extended Bethel University history community.
I am a Bethel graduate, 1988.
I'm a 1999 Bethel grad.
I'm a teacher at Minnehaha Academy.
I am the pastor of worship and adult ministries here at Church of the Cross.
Mutuality editor and publications coordinator.
I work as an attorney in the business and corporate practice.
English Language Institute, China, in China.
Library director at the College of St. Scholastica.
I'm a history professor at Bethel University.
I was a history major.
I was a Bethel history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
History major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
My name is Brandon Raatikka. I graduated in 2003, and I was a history major. I did want to major in history. My sister was a history major at Taylor, and so I thought if she could do it, so could I. And I saw Ken Burns' Civil War documentary on PBS when I was maybe 11 years old, and I think I got a romantic view of history based on that documentary, so I've been fascinated with history ever since. It's how ideas affect society and how people have different philosophies and how those interact. And at the time, I think I was very fascinated by military history as well, sort of the tactical maneuvers of the Confederate and Union armies during the Civil War. So it was kind of fun to kind of keep score as to what each battle. So I originally went to Bethel thinking that I was going to go to grad school and get my PhD and become a history professor. But I think my junior year I decided that I wanted to keep my love of history maybe separate from my career. Plus I had just gone to Oxford and saw all of the brilliant scholars that I would be competing with for jobs. So at that point I decided that law was probably the other natural choice for studying history. The highlight of my college career was studying abroad in the University of Oxford, studying English history there for a semester. And I obviously wouldn't have pursued that had I not been a history major, been in the history program, interested in those types of things. And that to me was maybe the biggest experience I had of personal growth. You know, it was the first time I had lived essentially outside the state. You know, I lived in another country for 100 days and had to learn a new culture. Now, albeit England's Siberia, but it was the first time I had really traveled, and so I think it really opened up I think that I really realized what was possible with experiences in the world. I realized that I could travel a lot more, I could do a lot more, because I was able to do that. So, and it exposed me to a lot of diverse experiences as well while I was studying and forming new relationships and stuff like that. I think what history trains you for in terms of intellectual fitness, critical thinking skills, writing skills, that really dovetails well with law as well, practicing law, being able to argue your case, support it with facts, etc. So, you know, it is a very natural course of study for people that are going into the law field. And I think what prepared me for law was being able to process a lot of information at one time and critically assess it and write about it very clearly. So you really hone your critical thinking and writing skills in particular. And that actually helped me, I think, right onto law review after my first L year. You know, I was sitting in my third year in law school in my estate planning class, and that's my final year of law school. And I realized how absolutely boring that was. I had planned on being an estate planning lawyer and memorizing different provisions of the Treasury regs and Internal Revenue Code and stuff like that, and realizing that's not really what I wanted to do. But I did have an interest in commercial real estate and residential real estate. So at that point I realized that if I didn't practice law, and the job market wasn't terribly great, particularly great when I graduated, I decided that I wanted to have my career involve real estate in some capacity. And so that's what I sought out. And then after law school, I had a job with a company that did site acquisition and identification for cell phone sites. And so that, helped me at least satisfied some of my desire for being in commercial real estate, but at Factorite it's really been increased a lot. I started out as a research analyst. I would assess the legal and the financial and the asset specific aspects of these private securities offerings or investments. And we had 4 employees at the time, and since then we've grown to almost 20 now. And as I've moved through the company, I've taken on more and more responsibility as it relates to the operations of the company. So I still act as sort of a part-time analyst on these securities offerings, but I also oversee other analysts in their work, and I participate in sales and marketing with the company. I help build out processes and procedures, which is something key as a small company. a small growing company to be able to contribute to that. So I have a much more bigger hand in the operations of the company than I did when I started out as a research analyst. History is part of a liberal arts education, and obviously the goal of liberal arts is to produce well-rounded individuals. And especially at a small company like mine, we have to wear so many different hats, and we have to problem solve all day long in various areas of our business. Whether we're working in the business on the actual products that we're providing to our customers, or we're working on the business helping to develop the infrastructure of the company. So I found that to be very helpful. I think history gets you to deal with and become comfortable with ambiguity, helping to recognize the significance of facts, how they fit together, and how they affect the big picture, which I think is a huge advantage in business. I think that history majors should not underestimate their skill set. There's not, other than teaching and maybe law, there's not a very apparent job career track for history majors. And I think that can be intimidating, especially for history majors that want to go into the private sector. But history majors, like I said, they have practice with writing, which is something that can distinguish you in the business world. They have good experience with dealing with things that aren't black and white, being able to argue a position, being able to critically assess and problem solve. I think that history majors don't get enough credit for how creative they can be as well. So I think that any business would definitely appreciate the things that a history major can bring to the table in those regards. I would say enjoy it. I mean, I think college is a great opportunity to learn stuff that you want to learn and really enjoy classes and just really relish the opportunity to study at a good school with stuff that you're interested in.
I looked for an internship just to kind of give me some more views of like different areas and aspects of museums, and just even looking at living history versus like the Minnesota Historical Society, and seeing just if there was an area that I could find my niche in, or just things I was passionate about that I didn't realize. And so I ended up working with Item Homestead, which is a living history museum. It's set on a farm between 1890 and 1910, which I chose that one. There were very few various ones. I could be working with an archives at the downtown Central Library and their special collections, but this one just was more appealing just because it was something I hadn't encountered, and I thought it was good to explore that a bit too. I loved the staff, and so getting ready for our Spring on the Farm event was just really fun, even though just planning everything from the Doug Oman photo presentation of his historic barns, but also just planning like flowers and planting herbs for the kids, and just very tangible physical tasks I was given. I really liked that, and having deadlines and meeting those, but just getting to work on that with the staff there was really enjoyable.
Our tour continues in New Ulm, Minnesota. In the 1850s, this was a major center of especially German-American settlement. After the treaties of 1851, land was taken away from the Dakota, and it was used to recruit European settlers. And so to this day, New Ulm is a kind of German-American hub. The town grew very quickly and then was a major target for the Dakota when war broke out in August of 1862. It was attacked a couple of times. Part of the town was burned down. It was an easier target than nearby Fort Ridgely, which was well defended. We're standing in front of the Brown County Courthouse in kind of the center of town, and you see over my shoulder a memorial that was put up in 1949, the 100th anniversary of Minnesota becoming a territory. So we've talked a little bit about commemoration on this trip, and you'll see a couple more examples before we're done, but obviously this is a very complicated war to remember well. What is this a story of exactly? Is this a story of exploitation of an indigenous population? Well, to some extent, yeah, but for the people who designed this memorial, it's a story of courageous pioneers. If you read the inscription, it talks about people who brought democratic principles to this land. On the other side of the memorial are listed dozens of names of European men, women, and children who died in the War of 1862. So we'll see kind of the changes in commemoration over time, but this memory is still alive and is still contested. I once wrote a short blog post about other memorials here in New Ulm, about the World Wars, and I included a picture of this. And whatever I said was not sufficient for one commenter. He wrote in to explain how badly the pioneers have been treated, and he actually copied and pasted in all the names that are on the back of this memorial. This is still very much a live issue in Minnesota. Okay, let's go to our last half of our faculty conversation for the season of Past and Presents.
So we talked some about vocation and calling. I do want to come back to career, because
Sure.
I hear everything you're saying. I also know students, or at least their parents, are concerned, and I feel like I always struggle, right? Because my answer to what do you do with a history major is you can do anything with a history major, because of all the things you had just said, because we equip you with all these skills. At the same time, it's nice to tell at least stories of here's some kind of unexpected, out-of-the-box things history majors have. Do you have a favorite story? Maybe it's your own story, maybe it's a relative, maybe it's a former student you've had. What's your favorite, like, kind of surprising history major who went? It might even be a kind of predictable career like teaching, but it took a different form or something like that.
Yeah, I guess I can think of one of my closest friends who was a history major at the same time that I was here at Bethel, who did sort of start in a traditional path and started by being a teacher and was a middle school teacher and then a high school teacher, and then found that she was really interested in kind of both the academic and personal counseling sides of what she saw at school, and went on to get her degree in school counseling, and totally felt like being a history major helped her thrive in that context, not only just sort of the skills needed for graduate school, but also her way of thinking holistically and historically about the various sort of issues and things that she was studying, and to understand even things like educational trends, and to sort of see what the trajectory has been over time, and then now has transitioned into working for the State Department. So, here she is on career 3. They've all been really good careers, and each one has sort of built on the one prior to it, but the thing linking them together, she would articulate, I think, is the skills that she gained as a history major. And I think that even now, she doesn't necessarily know that that's where she's going to be in 10 years. She has all kinds of options, but they're really all related to her skill set, but she still totally embraces and sees herself as a history major and talks about all of her jobs sort of coming out of that.
I think, too, of Lauren Peffley, who is a graduate of Bethel University, and she was a history major, and I don't know if she had another major or minor, but she ended up working for International Justice Mission after graduating, and now she's pursuing a graduate degree in social work. And I think it was really helpful for her in her work with human trafficking to have that historical background, and then, of course, as she's going into graduate school, having those research skills and things like that. But I think she wants to be someone who's not just an activist at the ground level. She wants to be doing policy changes. And I think, that has been really helpful then to have that academic background as she moves from working at the ground level into then higher level, big change kinds of things.
I think it's really important to put an S on career. I mean, it's actually important.
Yep.
It's so rare that you're going to have like a 40-year career that's not, you're going to change, the field is going to change, technology is going to change, the needs of whoever you're serving is going to change. And so I hear this a lot. It might not be 3 careers, it might be 2, or it might be a shift, but like history majors feel like they learned how to learn. So they can go back to graduate school. Maybe Lauren didn't think about social work, but she had this, Buechner talks about, deep gladness being a calling. It makes you, it's a love, it's a passion, but also the world's deepest need is a calling too. And maybe she had that sense of need.
Yeah, she did.
And thought, well, I didn't think of this when I was 19, but now that I'm 22 or 23, social work can do this. And she was set up for grad school. One of my favorite stories is Kim Pegalo, who was probably like 3 years before Lauren, did her senior STEM project in like Russian history in the 1930s, and then decided to go back and become a nurse. And did this really, had to do all the kind of intro level science coursework. Went back, she's a public health nurse, I think. And, we talked to her about it, and there's this kind of sense, well, nurses do history. You've got to interview people and pick out data that fits and explains and discern patterns. But it's also just that she was ready, she was equipped to go back and read a lot and master a lot of material. And so that's an advantage, too, is your career might change. But
I think one of the interesting things about being a history major is that it's risky in the sense that you, the study of history means that you're always opening yourself up to being compelled by something that you're not going to be able to stop thinking about. And that may, lead you into doing something different than you had originally planned. Or again, it's planting some seed, thinking about Lauren's work of something that you just cannot let go of. And back to your idea of suffering, it's sort of that idea that historians develop this empathy through being exposed to some really awful stuff, but yet that also, then you can't ignore it, and then you're responsible for it. And that might lead you in a different direction, whatever sort of responsibility that you feel for it. So it actually brings a tremendous amount of vulnerability, I think, to study history, because you realize you may stumble upon something that then is going to move your life in a different direction.
Yeah, I don't want to spiritualize these choices too much, but I think there is a degree that majoring in something like history requires some faith, certainly. I mean, it's not, if I do this, I will be then in control of my life. It's a kind of yieldedness, right? To say, first of all, that I'm much smaller. If you study history, one thing you should take away is that, individuals are very important, but they're also affected by forces well beyond their control and structures. And I think you learn that, and you might kind of push back against that sense that I've got my life mapped out. And when I'm 18, I know exactly the things I've got to jump through in order to get that salary and that office and that kind of lifestyle. And so I would hope that, if nothing else, makes you a little bit more comfortable with the vicissitudes, all the turns you don't expect.
Well, and I think that it may be a very, I think it's kind of a comforting thing when you stumble upon something and you realize, I care about this even if no one else thinks this is interesting or no one else does. Now, sometimes that can create a point of connection, because what you're reading, you may realize, oh, actually someone else cared about it. And you feel a connection with somebody from the past. But at the same time, I think that that for me is what's comforting about being a historian, is finding something that you just can, you think about dissertation work or things like that you find something so compelling that you're just going to continue to care about it even if nobody else does. And the discipline, I think, rewards that. That's a good thing to do.
Well, and I think it also plays into the notion of a Christian calling. Part of the reason why you take up the tragedy is because you do have hope.
That's right.
That you can be part, in some teeny tiny way even, of the redemptive process.
Right. And part of the redemptive process is, I think, just acknowledging that something needs to be remembered. Even if nothing's going to change, I think that's a big part of it, is that it's honoring that it happened.
Our tour ends in the city of Mankato, Minnesota. The actual conflict of 1862 really ended in late September at a place called Wood Lake. There was a battle between about 1,200 Dakota and 2,000 European American soldiers, in which the white side won decisively. At that point, most of the Dakota warriors left, but several hundred were arrested. 1,600 men, women, and children were interned at a concentration camp by Fort Snelling. And several hundred of the warriors then in November were convicted and sentenced to death, 303 of them. At that point, the Episcopal Bishop of Minnesota, Henry Whipple, advocated for their life and wrote a letter to President Abraham Lincoln trying to describe the conditions of the Native Americans in Minnesota and trying to save their lives. Lincoln apparently reviewed each case personally and ended up commuting all but 38 sentences of death. It was very controversial. The Republican governor of Minnesota, Alexander Ramsey, warned that being too lenient would cost Republicans at the next election, which it may have done in 1864. In the end, though, on the day after Christmas, December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota were led out with a guard of something like 1,400 troops to be hanged at this site here in Mankato for a public execution. It's the single largest mass execution in American history, and makes this a really tragic conclusion to our story. In the end, the vast majority of the Dakota were exiled, most of them to South Dakota, to Nebraska. Only a very few are left. And just another chapter in the sad story of the frontier in Minnesota. This, however, has become a place in some ways of reconciliation. I'm standing by a plaque that was put up by the Minnesota Historical Society in 1975 at the time of the first reconciliation ceremony, and across the street here is Reconciliation Park. And so this has become an epicenter of these kind of Sankofa journeys through the Minnesota River Valley and their regular kind of reconciliation commemorative ceremonies that take place here. So thanks for joining us on our tour of the U.S. Dakota conflict of 1862 in the Minnesota River Valley, and thanks for joining us this season on Past and Presents, whether you're a student in Intro to History or you've been watching us out in YouTube land. We appreciate that you've joined us on this journey.
Back, baby, back in time.